Chris, I'll briefly introduce you. I understand you're another journalist turned fintech entrepreneur. Is that true?
Yeah.
I'm beginning to think journos are all becoming fintech.
Yeah. So I was a journalist, magazine journalist, not investigative journalist. Did features, worked for a whole variety of different magazines, Arena, Face, Time Out, things like that, and then ended up publishing magazines, and then had my own publishing company, magazine publishing company. And I got into this area very much by accident. I wanted to go back into journalism after having sold my company, and specifically wanted to do data journalism, and I found there was no data out there for the sorts of things I wanted to do. So I ended up getting involved in open data, and for a long time people said, "What do you do, Chris?" And I said, "I open data, whether people like it or not." And what we first did, one of the first things I did was I did a site opening up local council data, I thought that we'd get into lots of difficulties. And what happened was the government contacted me and said, "We like what you're doing. Will you come and sit on this panel advising us about opening up local data?" So we were screen scraping websites and council websites. And this is sort of how we got onto OpenCorporates, which is something that in some ways is deeply unsexy. It's really right on the ground with the scrabbling around in the dirt of data about companies. And the reason we do this is because we had this need for something like this to exist. So it's the largest open database of companies in the world. What does that mean? What are we trying to do? We've got a simple goal. It's simple, but it's a really big one. We want an openly licensed database. That's a database that's under a license that allows you to reuse it freely. It contains an entry for every single company in the world. And by company, we mean a legal entity. So, so something like Microsoft there is no such thing as Microsoft. What there are is Microsoft Research UK Limited, there's Microsoft Inc., there's all sorts of other things. Legal entities, we think, is one of the undiscovered, at least by most users, most people out there don't really understand that this is the reality of companies. We started about 2 years ago with 3 million companies. We've now got actually 54 million companies. We've grown from that. And the reason we do this is because everywhere you move these days, you encounter companies. You encounter something to do with companies. When your rubbish is picked up by the council, it's done by a company. When you walk down the street, when you're on the phone, when you are going through the turnstiles, when you're doing everything you do is to do with companies. You will have literally thousands of interactions with companies every single day. But actually what is going on, and actually when you're thinking about somewhere like where we are today, what's actually really going on is very different from what most people perceive it. And by most people, I don't just mean NGOs and campaigners and so on and journalists, but I also mean SMEs. I also mean the competitors, the other companies that they're dealing with you. Once upon a time, a company looked like this. It was a physical bricks and mortar place. Then, now we have more people will think of it as being this, some sort of headquarters of a company. But actually, it's not like that. It's much more like this. When Lehman Brothers went to the wall, their last filing that they did to the SEC in the US said they had 301 significant subsidiaries. This is sort of some of the changes in their network. This was done quite a while ago by people looking at the SEC filings. 301 subsidiaries. The Bank of International Settlement report they did a few years later found 2,985 different legal entities in the group. And so what do? We do something really, really trivial. I was talking earlier before this event, or just at the beginning of this event, about early days as a journalist, and talking about going to a company's house on City Road. And in those days, you'd go there, you'd make an application, you'd wait an hour or a couple of hours, you'd get back microfiche, you'd look at this information. In the meantime, I'd probably go to the City Business Library near the Guildhall, look up some trade directories, maybe some US telephone directories, because that was one of the few places in the country that had them. Now, you know, and then go back to look at these microfiches. These days, actually, most of what I did at City Business Library is a Google search. It takes 30 seconds. And similarly, but actually, this isn't the case with company information. Actually, finding out company information in disparate locations is really, really difficult. So just to be able to do one thing, searching for, so this is doing something that's really, really trivial and really, in some ways, quite uninteresting. It basically says, okay, this is what we've got with Tesco's in our database. Why Ambassador Ventures 1 Limited? Well, because it used to be called Tesco's. Now, and actually, if you go onto the Company's House website, you have to say, oh, I want to search for companies called Tesco. I will come back with the companies called Tesco. Oh, I need to search, what about the companies that used to be called Tesco? Oh, well, that's a different database. You have to search a different database for that. So just doing these things. And actually, when you multiply that by numerous locations, we've got 70 different jurisdictions in OpenCorporates, then it becomes so much more difficult. Do you even know where the Croatian company register is and how to search that? Never mind, you know, the 29 US states that we've got. So just doing this one thing is incredibly useful. And actually the fact that it's got things like, well, you know, it might have, you know, Ireland, the Isle of Man, India, actually 1.2 million companies in India. We've got the Pakistan companies, we're about to add Bangladesh, we've got things like Greenland and so on. Someone in PwC's forensic accounting department and business just outside DC, they said that they use that as they use OpenCorporates as their first line of defense. Not because we're open, because we're the place that makes this sort of stuff trivial. It's not terribly sexy, but it is really important. So the other reason why, so there's two reasons why it's, why thinking about things at the legal entity is critical. The first thing is that is the reality. I mean, people are so used to dealing with companies, we've actually forgotten what a company is. A company is an artificial creation, a concept, if you like, that's been given a legal personality or allowed to have a separate legal personality. So I could say, hey, look, I've just set up a company, Dodgy Enterprises, Inc. Are you going to do business with it? Are you going to sue it? Can it employ people? No, because I don't actually have the right to suddenly do this. I can say I've done something, but I haven't done it. When you go to Companies House and set up a company, or the Delaware Secretary of State, or wherever, what you're doing is, I'm doing this, and the state says, yes, we recognize that in law. We allow this concept to employ people. We allow that concept to have assets and liabilities. And actually, more than that, we'll even allow it to have limited liability, which says when the assets, when the liabilities exceed the assets, the people who suffer, people who wear that loss between the difference, are not going to be the shareholders or the manager. They're going to be the people who don't get paid, for example, for the goods that they've supplied, or who don't get the goods that they bought, or the employees that don't get paid, or the taxes that don't get paid. So this is really quite a strange thing, and there have even been operas written about this. And Gilbert and Sullivan wrote an opera about the strangeness of this joint stock limited liability enterprise. And people have forgotten how strange this is. It's one of those things that like a dollar or a pound, fiat money, once you start to think about it, your head starts to explode a little bit. So, but the point is that the reason Lehman Brothers would have 2,985 different legal entities was not because they like that number and they like to have big numbers associated with them. It wasn't even that there was someone in that department who got paid bonuses the more companies they did. It was because they got some benefit from it or perceived benefit from it. And if you're doing a business with one of those, then it matters to you how that is connected, who you're really doing business with. So we're involved in a thing called the Financial Stability Board's Global Legal Entity Identifier System, which is a real mouthful, but it's basically about giving global identifiers to participants in the financial markets. And the reason this is important is the day after Lehman Brothers, all the chief accounting officers around the world said, okay, what's our exposure to Lehman Brothers? And people said, well, what do you mean by Lehman Brothers? Do you mean Shearson Lehman Brothers? Do you mean Lehman Brothers Holdings? Do you mean this thing over here, which we think has got something to do with Lehman's, but we're not quite sure? And the question is why does this matter? It's a question of who do you sue? Who do you go to for redress? So it really matters on that basis, but it matters for another reason, which is the reason why they need legal personality. So if you want to employ somebody, if you want to take a lease out with somebody, if you want to have a contract from the government doesn't contract to Microsoft, it'll contract to a legal entity because only something with legal personality can have a contract. So what we're doing is we're taking government data from all places around from around the world, and we're doing this with a relatively limited way to begin with, but we're about to ramp this up in a huge way the second half of this year, and matching it to the companies. So when you see a contract in, let's say, Liberia, then that's going to be associated for the extractive industry, that's going to be associated with a legal entity, and it's going to it's almost certainly have, and it should have, the legal name of that company there. So by dealing with it at the base level, at this legal entity level, we don't want something. Somebody said to me, "Oh, Chris, when are you going to have it so that there's one page about Barclays, and give you all the financials about Barclays PLC, and that it says this and this about the Barclays?" It's like that's not what our business is about. You know, you can do that on Yahoo, you can do that on Google, you can do that on a whole number of sites, find out what those financials are. But what you can't do is find out what businesses they've got in India easily. You can't find out, for example, when they've just applied for trademarks, for example. You know, these sorts of things, you can't find out when they've had a banking license removed from them. These things are much more difficult. So there's things like trademarks. Official Gazette notices, official government, for example, London Gazettes in this country or the Memorial in Luxembourg and so on, a mine of great information. So we know, for example, who the shareholder of Facebook Lux is, not because Facebook have declared it on their SEC form, because according to the SEC form, Facebook Lux doesn't exist. Not because we've got that it's in the filings at Luxembourg Company Register, but it's in the Gazette. It's in the official Gazette as a byproduct from that. Health and safety violations, FDIC registers, government spending and contractors. And actually this is all open data as well. So anyone can search for this on this website, it's free and it's under an open license. So a couple of other things. Directors is really interesting. Directors, once you start to do directors across jurisdictions, things start to become quite interesting. They're interesting for two reasons. The first is actually in a global world where you have global companies, then there are many people who are directors across the directors in all sorts of countries. So one of the interesting things, I was in tail end of last year, I was in Nairobi for a couple of days with some journalists over there and seeing Nairobi journalists having fun, finding powerful people in Kenya who are directors on the UK Company Register and other places that we've got. But yeah, this is another one, Mitt Romney, for example. Now, Mitt Romney is a director of these companies, many of which are inactive. Now, as a journalist, you think, oh, that company, it's quite an old company. Let's see if there's some information there. The second thing is that many of these companies in the US, they don't declare information in the US, but if they do business elsewhere, for example, Healthcare Acquisition was a Delaware company, very little information in Delaware, but if they do business in Mississippi, they have to declare more information. So you can triangulate information together and start pulling this in. Finally, what we're doing is collecting all this data, and what we're really interested in is having this as a platform, having other people build cool stuff on top of it. By pulling all this together, it allows all sorts of things to happen. I'm just going to quickly whiz through. This is something that somebody did, and it was just tying together directors and some interesting things. He's since done some even more interesting ones about how the networks sort of work together of directors and companies. What we're doing now is corporate networks, companies that are who owns who, and this is actually both really interesting and really tricky. I'm going to come on to, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from the site, some live examples from the site to explain why it's so difficult. We're adding crowdsourcing to this as well. And by crowd, we don't just mean people in their bedrooms at night and so on. We also mean businesses as well, for information about their competitors, for example, or their suppliers. And this is one of the reasons why you need crowdsourcing. This is Google's subsidiaries reported to the SEC. This was what it looked like in 2009. And we just did a story on this with the Wall Street Journal that came out this morning. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like now. 2 companies, they declare, both in Ireland. So we're doing all sorts of interesting things with things like Financial Stability Board, World Bank's a client, and various other people. We're open. And actually, there's a couple of other things I just want to mention before I show the network stuff, and then I'll shut up. So one of the things we think about open data is actually we think open data is really important from a public good. Things like company registers were always meant to be open. The point is that when you as a supplier are bearing the risk, if you like, because of this limited liability, then it's important you know who you're doing business with. And if you don't know what the connections between this company and this company are, who's behind it, what their previous track record is, that's very difficult to do. So we think this information, it's out there in the public domain for a reason, it's a public good, but much of it is separated in silos. Now, we think that this is important as a public good, but also we think that by having this information in the open, it also increases the quality. We are finding problems with data all the time, and we're finding problems with the data all the time in part because we're combining it with other data sets. It's never been combined with. It's a great way of finding problems with data, combining it with other data sets. And in part because people are discovering problems themselves with their data. They're Googling it and they're finding it and they're saying the data's wrong here. I'm no longer director, and it's because the information, the official register is actually wrong. But it also allows these collective action problems to go away. It allows people to contribute at virtually 0 cost. We have 2.5 people working for OpenCorporates at the moment. We're about to hire 2 more, but at the moment we're 2.5. We've grown to over 50 million companies. We're being used by banks, by major people all around the world, and it's taken 2.5 people. And that's because it's open data. It really reduces the cost. It moves duplication. Those closed models, when you get information from Dun & Bradstreet, and they say, this company, this Dunn's number, what's the parent of this? And they'll tell you. And you'll say, okay, how do you know that? Where did you get that information from? How accurate is it? What's the provenance? They can't do that. Provenance is absolutely critical. In the modern world, where did you get this information from? When did you get it? How confident are you about it? So our business model is basically we license it under a share-alike license that allows people to reuse it. And then but if you want to pull it into a proprietary database or private database, we charge for that. Just quickly, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs if I've got time. And this works. So this is a preview of the stuff that's going to be launching sometime next month. We're still got tweaking some of the layouts and so on, and it's a bit difficult to see on the BGA screen. But this is what one of the public corporations in New Zealand look like. So we've got New Zealand shareholding information here, and you can see that these are all the children, these are all the parents. Because it's a public corporation, you've got many nominee companies as parents. This is actually This is a multiple simplification. Tom was talking earlier about how you take all of this stuff together and find useful stuff in it. This and this is actually a simplification of the data that we've got, and we're making all the data, underlying data available to make it useful for people. But even this, some of these companies are owned by, have got multiple ones, and if you tie those together to show the graph view, this is what you get. This is the network just around this company. Now, if I can go the right way around, do the right zoom. So you start to see some of these links in the chain. Now this is actually still being built. We've got about 2/3 of the way through New Zealand shareholding data, and a couple of other, just a quick one. So this is an example. This is one of those ones that was with a link in, but actually has multiple links in from the shareholding information. This is another interesting one. This is IBM. This here is what is reported they report to the SEC as being their companies. So if you look at the SEC reports, which is text, by the way, and in a mess and slightly laggy, this is what you'll see. These ones here don't exist on it. This has come from New Zealand shareholding data. So it declares this one, but it doesn't even mention these. So by pulling these different sources of data together, then you can start to see things which aren't otherwise there. We're doing some interesting stuff at the moment with some of the finance on the banking companies. So this is what we've got so far about Barclays from a number of sources. This is generally the SEC stuff here. And what we're doing, you'll see that actually we haven't, we're not saying this is the canonical view. Sometimes we actually will say, here's a contradiction, we'll show contradictions. This stuff here is coming from the Federal Reserve's database they have a thing called the bank hierarchy database. We got that from their website because they were unable to give us it as data because it was going to be too difficult to get out of their legacy system. And so when we got it from their website. And then what happened? We found quite a lot of errors on it. And we fed it back to them. And by combining it with other things, we discovered the errors. There were things which we thought we should have matched, we should have made sense of, and we should have done it. But this is evolving. If I look at this graph in about 2 weeks' time or something, this will have evolved further. This is all adding up. So I think but this is in a sense the point. We want all of these underlying things. This thing here to this thing here. We don't just say this comes from this. When you get that information from Dun & Bradstreet, the question is how good is Dun & Bradstreet's hierarchy data? Well, they themselves say we will only guarantee it to 60%. But that's in itself is a real problem for me. Not because they'll guarantee it to 60%, but they won't say what that 60% is an average. Now, what I want to know is where did you get that information from? That this thing here is a parent of this thing. Did you get it from the annual report that came out 6 months ago? Did you get it from some shareholding filing that came out 3 months ago? Did you get it from some information that company told you itself about it 3 years ago when they registered for a DUNS number? Or did you get it because it was modelled, because it was the same name as something? Now, as a journalist, I can cope with data being bad. If people say, if I'm investigating a company, if some people say, okay, we're only 30% confident, that's okay because 3 of those leads will turn out to be accurate. But if I'm a credit reference agency or doing credit metrics, building together these things, then actually I really want to know whether it's going to be 30% or 70%. If I know what the figure is, I can factor that in accordingly. So that's why we're doing the hierarchy stuff. And thank you. I think I've spoken long enough now.
Chris, let's get some questions for Chris.
It looks like a great piece of work, by the way, but a couple of things. How do you manage false positives and negatives? Say, for example, company directors sharing the same name. And do you provide an indication of the confidence in the data you're presenting? And what do you do about LLPs, organisations registered in the BVI are difficult to get to places?
Yeah. So the first thing, let me take the last one first of all, and I'll work back. So there's lots of jurisdictions we don't have at the moment. Where do we get our information from? Some governments, at one point we scraped virtually all of it, screen scrape, where you send a program to look at a website and you turn that web page into data. In fact, we still get a fair amount of data like that. We've got huge amounts of scrapers running in the background all the time. But increasingly, governments are giving us data. We get feeds from Companies House, of course, New Zealand Companies House, Irish Companies House, Norway, talking with the Danish government about giving us big dumps, various other things. But there's also places we don't have. We actually don't have France, we don't have Germany. Italy, I think we're on the cusp of getting. But there are big gaps like that because we won't buy the data. And it's not we won't buy the data because we're mean, it's that we want to have our business model. And actually, it's important that this information is, if we bought the data, then we'd have to restrict it to people, and we don't think that's right, and also that's not what we're about. But there's places like BVI, for example, which are secrecy jurisdictions. Actually, if I show you this one with with Barclays here, this is one that was, this one here is Ember Investments LLP. Which wasn't, sorry, not that one, let me show you a different one. This was a company, this was one of the errors we found here. Cloudus Investments 2 Limited of Luxembourg in Luxembourg. This is actually from the Federal Reserve System. And we couldn't find it, and we've got most places that are called with limited in it, that have limited form. And so we did some searching and we thought, Luxembourg, okay, well then maybe that's a spelling mistake, maybe there's other spelling mistakes. So we found Cloudus Investments 2 Limited. Actually, here are the directors. And the reason this is interesting is the directors is this is not a UK company, this is a foreign branch of a Cayman Islands company. So often what you find is that you can by pulling this together, you can start to do, you can find these sorts of things. I think it's highly likely that that BVI and the Cayman Islands and those ones, Cayman Islands actually is already talking about opening up its register, that they will do that because they're going to be, increasingly it's going to be a business problem for them not to do so, in the same way that the Bahamas for a while, it was actually quite bad to be incorporated in the Bahamas because it was assumed that you were drug dealers, essentially. So I think that they will start to do that. That's not to say that they'll be entirely open, but I think by pulling this information together, we can do that. The false positives, false negatives. On directors, we never say that this person is the same as this person. It's a different type of problem. We say that these are similarly named people and to these similarly named people. The false positives, we've actually got a lot of data. I mean, in terms of data that we've matched to companies, we've got an awful lot of data that we haven't matched to companies that's internal to us. And as our systems get better and as we get more in terms of companies, so one of the things you want to know is not just whether it is named this company. Tesco Mobile Limited, I think, has been used as a legal name by 4 different legal companies, 4 different legal entities in the last 12 years, something like that. And each of them has had different names. So just because a company is called the same as another company, there's 2 references to the same name of company, doesn't mean it's the same company. And because it's a different name, it doesn't mean it's not. So what we do is we are very cautious about doing it, about doing that mapping, and we err towards false negatives than false positives. I think we've had 1 false positive that we've been alerted to so far. And the other ones that we've had that have been errors like that have actually been errors at the source records as well. So we tend to do that. In fact, I think sometimes we err slightly too much to the to avoiding false positives. And once we get the crowdsourcing stuff going, then we'll be able to say, here are some possible matches. Now you help do that based on the quality of the data that the user's already provided and so on. So yeah.
Just one other thing. I mean, I don't know if they're still around, but have you heard of Trampoline Systems?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, well, what they do is that they map comms networks, and if you overlaid that with this kind of insight, I think you'd get some extraordinary results. It might be worth communicating with them.
Cool. Thanks.
How do you manage the time dimension? So obviously, in particular, ownership relationships change over time.
It is, and it's one. So we've been working now for the last 6 months on the hierarchy stuff, and it's really, really difficult. And it's one of the reasons why the proprietary hierarchy stuff is actually fairly low quality is because it's really difficult, and also because, to be fair to them, they started 20 years ago or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and are stuck with legacy systems and legacy modeling. So we spent a lot of time on that. And in fact, one of those things, there's one here, and at the moment we are, so this one here is, if I can find, sorry, I'm just trying to find the right one. So this one here, Healthcare REIT, which is a real estate investment trust. It's one of the main owners of care homes and hospitals. You'll see that these companies in the middle actually owned, according to the SEC records, by both these and these. And this is from their SEC records. Now, actually, one of the problems with SEC records is they come out once a year, and they're 3 months out of date, or 2-3 months out of date. What we're doing here is there's enough overlap on that time to say that it is, but one of the things that we might not have it at launch, but we're storing all of the dates with the fuzziness of it, and then we've got various things to do with it, allowing it to be things to contradict others at certain dates and so on. It's actually relatively simple, the modeling, but the concept is quite complex, if you see what I mean. So the question is when you have an official filing, then there's a reporting date. The question, was it true the day before? Was it true the day after? Was it through 3 months after? Was it through 6 months after? Those things where we're taking some guesses. But the point is that if you know better than us, so what we're going to be doing is letting you see the underlying data to that. And if you know better than us, you get to make your own decisions about that.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more. In that case, I'll take it, which is, do you get people in trouble with the SEC?
Not so far, but there is an interesting story. So I was meeting a journalist in New York who I didn't know, and I just happened to be round the corner from him and knew him from we'd both been on the same conversation on investigative journalist mailing list. And I said, I'm just around the corner, have you got time for a coffee? Turned out, he worked for Barron's, the financial newspaper in the States. It turned out that he was already using OpenCorporates, and he said, look, I really want you to get the SEC's filings much better. I want you to basically have all the SEC filings in there and start to decompose it and do it. And that's something that we're looking at the moment. And he said, this is what I'm doing. I'm looking for stock fraud. My job as a journalist here at Barron's is finding stock fraud. We were talking about this, and I'd been meeting with financial people previously that, and we were talking about the similarities between investigative journalists and financial analysts and so on. And he said, actually, I used to work for a hedge fund. I was a journalist, and I worked for a hedge fund for 2 years, and now I'm back as an investigative journalist. And what I did at a hedge fund is exactly what I do now. I'm looking for, so the reason I want you to have this is that this is what I'm doing. This is how I research a company to see whether it's a fraudulent company. There's lots of companies that we've never heard of, that we never even notice, list on the stock markets in the US, do IPOs in the US. And he said, okay, so it's sort of like a little bit like this. I'm looking for this sort of number of initial share owners, and if maybe there's a few names that are connected with it, and this sort of stuff. He said, what I'm doing is I'm going through these filings, and this is what I'm doing. When I was at a hedge fund, the difference when I was at a hedge fund, we had coders to do this. We had people, I was doing exactly the same thing, but we had coders, we had programmers to do it, we had pretty strong resources to do exactly the same thing. And the reason is he's looking for a story to write. They're looking for something to short, because if it's a fraudulent IPO, then that's going to be worth nothing pretty soon. And so that's what they're looking for. So, and actually the Wall Street Journal stuff we've done today, I think we'll get a reaction from the SEC, because the quality of the filings is actually fairly poor at the SEC, and I think they're going to realise that they need to do something about that. But yeah, thank you.
Chris, thank you very much.